Welcome in, everyone. Ready to dive deep into the world of Jack Welch, the guy who basically rewrote the rules of business, right? We're going behind the scenes with Welch himself, using firsthand accounts from a lecture where he looked back on his time as the CEO of General Electric, all those big decisions, those wins and losses.
Yeah, and what we're really trying to do today is kind of like, extract those really impactful lessons about how Welch led his whole philosophy on business. And I mean, you can't deny it, the huge impact his choices had on, GE's success. They were on fire.
All right, so where do we even begin with a story this big?
Well, you can't really talk about Jack Welch without talking about culture. And
What?
there's just no better way to illustrate this culture first thing he had going on than the Kidder Peabody acquisition.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Now, for anyone who might not know, Kidder Peabody was this big Wall Street investment firm, right? And Welch, he had high hopes for this thing, but it turned into a total nightmare. What happened there?
It was a clash of cultures. It's as simple as that. Welch, he really believed in this thing they called the one currency principle at GE. Basically, the idea was that everyone, from the factory workers to the bigwigs in the offices, they're all working towards the same goal, the company's success. But Kidder Peabody, man, they were a completely different animal.
Okay, so how were they so different?
Well, GE, they had this culture of transparency. Everyone shared responsibility. But at Kidder Peabody, it seemed like individual bonuses and looking out for number one, that took priority over the well-being of the whole company. You know what I mean? And this all blew up in their faces when they found this like $350 million accounting hole all tied to this one rogue trader, Joseph Jett.
Wow, and I think it's interesting how Welch responded to that whole mess. He didn't play the blame game. He took responsibility, even though, he wasn't in the trenches at Kidder Peabody every day, calling the shots.
Yeah, and that tells you a lot about Welch as a leader. He believed in being accountable even when it meant owning up to his own mistakes. And this wasn't just for show. He was seriously messed up over the Kidder Peabody thing, like physically ill over it.
Yeah, and that next step he took, it really shows that one currency thing they had going on at GE. He goes to the leaders of the company to apologize. And get this, they offer to help cover the losses. Some of them even pledged millions from their own business units.
And then you contrast that with like what went down at Kidder Peabody. A lot of people there, according to Welch, they were more worried about saving their own bonuses than actually fixing the problem, and that difference in culture, man, that's a cautionary tale right there. It shows how important it is to have shared values when companies merge or when you're, buying another company.
Yeah, big lesson for anyone listening. You can try to bring in a company with a completely different culture, but it could blow up in your face even if the numbers look fantastic on paper.
Exactly. Culture.
It really is like the DNA of an organization, man. And, speaking of DNA, I think maybe it's time to shift gears a little bit and look at how Welch's understanding of this concept, how that played into the just explosive growth of GE Capital.
Yeah, this is where Welch's, his business smarts really shine through. He took GE Capital, which was, pretty small potatoes in the financial world back then, and turned it into this global powerhouse. By 2000, they were earning like $5.2 billion. That's up from just $67 million back in 1978. How did he do that?
Well, Welch had this vision, right? He wanted to blend financial, I guess you could call it ingenuity, with the discipline and the cash flow of a giant manufacturing company. He saw GE Capital like this sleeping giant, a way to bring like Wall Street smarts to Main Street businesses.
And he didn't just hand off this vision to someone else. He was really in the thick of it when it came to making deals. Oh yeah, super hands-on. Every single month they'd have these board meetings and potential deals would get like ripped apart. Welch jokingly called it a torture chamber. But, it was all these seasoned GE veterans in there. They'd like dissect every single proposal, make sure they were only going after the best opportunities.
But he was also open to taking risks. Right? Smart risks, And he wasn't scared to try something totally new, like that story about the Thai auto loan deal. At first glance, it sounded kind of crazy, but his team, they did their homework. They were passionate about it, and that won Welch over. And in the end, it was a pretty smart move for GE.
And what's so interesting about that story is, it shows that Welch was willing to, like, challenge his own assumptions. He trusted his team's expertise. Yeah, he was a strong leader, but he also knew when to, like, step back and let others take charge.
That makes me wonder, though, was he always so willing to step back? I'm thinking about that, acquisition of the Employers Reinsurance Corporation. Welch actually said he felt embarrassed after the deal was done because he demanded a price discount. The company, it fell short of their earnings expectations, and he kind of backtracked.
That's a good point. I mean, even the most successful leaders, they mess up sometimes. And Welch was, no different. But what's important is that he admitted those mistakes and he learned from them.
It's a recurring theme, it seems like, that
Yeah,
balance between confidence and humility. He was driven, but he also knew he didn't have all the answers.
absolutely. And that willingness to learn and to adapt, it was like super crucial when GE decided to jump into a whole new world. Media, they acquired RCA and NBC. Talk about a culture clash, light bulbs and television. Those are different worlds.
I'm curious about how Welch handled that. Did he try to force GE's culture onto NBC, or did he realize he needed a different approach?
Well, he was smart enough to know that NBC needed its own thing, its own culture. His priority was getting the right people in place. He fought tooth and nail to keep Brandon Tartikoff, the guy behind all of NBC's hit shows. And he convinced Bob Wright, who was a solid GE executive, to take over as CEO of NBC.
But even with a strong team, NBC still had some serious challenges, right? Cable was exploding, their news division was losing money, and let's face it, the entertainment industry, it's cutthroat.
Yeah, and there were some pretty funny culture clashes too. Welch was a diehard Red Sox fan, and he just couldn't believe that Larry Grossman, the president of NBC News, wasn't glued to the World Series, even with the Red Sox fighting for the championship.
Well, that's a fun little anecdote, but it shows those cultural differences that Welch ran into. Beyond those little clashes, though, there was this real need to deal with the financial issues at NBC, right?
Right, Welsh pushed for, cutting costs in the news division, and that didn't go over well with everyone. Some people thought he just didn't get the news business.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you had the Dateline controversy, which really put Welch's commitment to, you know, doing the right thing to the test.
Oh yeah, the Dateline truck explosion, that was huge. It really hurt NBC's credibility. They did this segment on the safety of General Motors trucks, and they showed footage of a truck exploding on impact. But it turned out the whole crash test was rigged.
Exactly. They got sued, and Jane Pauley, the Dateline anchor, had to apologize publicly. Michael Gardner, the head of NBC News, he wasn't directly responsible, but he ended up taking the fall. And Welch, he made it clear that accountability, no matter who you are, is not negotiable.
And it's striking how Welch tackled both the Dateline situation, which was about upholding journalistic standards, and then later those accusations of bribery involving GE's aircraft engine business and the Israeli Air Force. He had that same unwavering commitment to integrity.
Yeah, in both cases, he launched like full-blown internal investigations. He wanted to get to the bottom of things, hold people accountable, even if it meant disciplining people he'd known for years or even close friends.
Yeah, in that Israeli Air Force case, GE ended up paying almost $70 million in fines and penalties, and 21 employees, including 2 corporate officers, were disciplined.
It's a big reminder that ethical leadership, it's not about looking good. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's tough or, when it costs you something.
But this whole focus on integrity, it didn't mean that GE always played by the rules, did they? They went toe-to-toe with the EPA over those PCBs. And Welch, he was adamant that PCBs, while a concern, weren't an immediate threat to people or the environment.
He thought the EPA's demands to dredge the Hudson River were like politically driven and based on bad science. That fight shows Welch's, his courage to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant going up against a powerful government agency.
It seems like he was always pushing the limits, whether it was going against the grain on company culture or jumping into new markets or taking on government regulators.
Yeah, that's a big part of his legacy, right? He wasn't afraid to shake things up, to challenge how things were done. And that conviction, that fueled his drive to transform GE through things like globalization, services, and Six Sigma. It was like he was always hunting for the next big idea to push GE even further.
He had this knack for seeing opportunity where others saw problems. Like GE wasn't a big player globally, and their services business wasn't really developed. He turned those potential weaknesses into strengths.
And he didn't come up with those big ideas on his own either. Each initiative, it kind of grew organically from small ideas within the company. He built a culture where people could share ideas freely and passionate individuals could champion those ideas all the way to the top.
And once Welch was on board, he became like this unstoppable advocate, pushing for everyone to adopt it and demanding real, tangible results.
He wasn't just a visionary. He was a master of making things happen. He used everything he had, training programs, performance reviews, those infamous Session C meetings, even the stock option program, all to drive these initiatives forward and get everyone on the same page.
I think it's important to, remember what was happening in the world back then in the 80s and 90s. Things were changing fast. Globalization was accelerating, technology was turning industries upside down, and the competition was fierce. Welch knew that GE had to adapt, had to evolve to survive in this new world.
He wasn't just reacting to change, he was trying to anticipate it. He saw these challenges as opportunities to, reinvent GE, make them an even stronger global leader. And that's what makes his story so relevant even now. The specific challenges might be different today, but those basic principles of leadership, they're still the same.
So let's dig into one of those big transformations, globalization. Welch saw that as absolutely essential for GE's future. It wasn't just about, expanding into new markets. It was about embracing global talent and building a company without borders.
Right. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into Jack Welch and how he did things.
So last time we were about to get into Welch's approach to, taking GE global. It seems kind of obvious now, but back then, the idea of a truly global company, that was still pretty new.
Yeah, and Welch, he wasn't just chasing profits in these new markets. He really thought GE could be a force for good, creating jobs, sharing knowledge, building bridges across different countries.
Okay, that sounds pretty idealistic.
Mm-hmm.
But did he really, put his money where his mouth was?
Oh, absolutely. He put serious money into regions that a lot of other big companies, they weren't even touching. He saw opportunity where others just saw risk. And a perfect example of that is like GE getting into Eastern Europe early, even before the Berlin Wall came down.
That was a gutsy move. Most companies, they weren't exactly lining up to invest in Eastern Europe back then.
Right. But Welch saw the potential for growth in these markets, and he was willing to play the long game even when things were, politically and economically shaky. They got involved in joint ventures, bought up struggling state-owned companies, and basically brought GE's expertise and technology over there. They helped revitalize whole industries.
So it sounds like they were really hands-on, not just writing checks and hoping for the best.
Exactly. They were committed to developing local talent, giving people in those countries the power to lead and really contribute to GE's success. They understood that going global wasn't about forcing an American way of doing things. It was about, embracing different cultures and different perspectives.
Oh, I remember reading about GE buying that Hungarian lighting company, Tungsram, back in 1989. They negotiated that whole deal with the communist government just days before the Berlin Wall fell.
Talk about a symbolic moment. It really captured that feeling of, change that was happening all over the world.
Welch even joked about how they thought the Hungarian government was tapping their phones during the negotiations. They started feeding them fake information just to mess with them.
That's a great story. It shows how he could deal with these really tricky situations with, a mix of practicality and humor.
But that Tungsram deal, it wasn't just a symbolic win. They invested heavily in the company, modernized their facilities, and turned it into a profitable business, a major player in the European lighting market.
Yeah, it was a win-win, good for GE and good for Hungary. And it kind of opened the floodgates for more investments in Eastern Europe.
But their global strategy didn't stop at Europe. Welch also saw this huge potential in Asia, particularly China and India.
He knew that these markets growing so fast, they were going to be major players in the 21st century. They set up manufacturing in Asia, built partnerships, and really cultivated relationships with, key government and business leaders.
It sounds like they were thinking long-term, realizing that, building trust and understanding those local cultures was key to being successful in Asia.
And let's not forget about GE Capital. They played a huge role in the globalization strategy, financing a lot of these international acquisitions and investments. They basically provided the financial muscle to fuel GE's global expansion.
So it was a total team effort, all parts of GE working together to really push that global agenda. But Welch wasn't content with just, conquering the physical world. He recognized the power of the digital world, even if it took him a while to really get on board.
Yeah, he even admitted to being a bit late to the game when it came to the internet and e-business. He even joked that they were so focused on perfecting Six Sigma that they kind of missed the boat on that whole .com boom.
But once he saw the potential, he jumped in head first, classic Welch, determined to make GE a leader in this new digital landscape.
And it's interesting because, Welch didn't have some big master plan when he got into it. He relied on GE's existing culture, that open communication, sharing ideas, empowering people to guide them.
It was almost like the whole company was taking this crash course in e-business.
They were figuring it out as they went along, adapting their strategies and processes. One of the first things they did was create gesupply.com. It was an online platform to streamline how their industrial customers bought stuff from them.
That was a pretty bold move, especially for a company that was so rooted in, traditional manufacturing. It's like he was always pushing GE outside its comfort zone.
He knew the old ways weren't going to cut it in the digital age, and there was some resistance, both inside and outside the company. Some of their longtime suppliers, they weren't too keen on this whole online platform thing.
I can see why. They were probably worried about losing those relationships they'd built up over the years.
And they had internal hurdles, too. The sales teams, they were used to doing business face-to-face, and they had to, adapt to this new digital way of selling.
Change is tough, especially in a huge company like GE. But Welch, he didn't give up, did he?
No way. He was all in on this e-business thing. He saw it as essential for GE to stay competitive. And he used the same tactics that worked for him before. Ambitious goals, holding people accountable, celebrating those early wins.
So what were some of those early wins?
Well, their plastics business, they launched an online auction platform for their extra inventory. And that was a huge success, made them millions and brought in new customers.
It showed that e-business wasn't just about cutting costs. Right? It could actually open up whole new ways to make money.
And it showed that Welch was willing to experiment, learn from both the successes and the failures. He understood that e-business was constantly changing, and they had to be flexible to stay ahead of the curve.
Besides connecting with customers, he also focused on using technology to improve how things worked inside GE, right?
Yeah, he saw that these same digital tools, the ones changing how they worked with customers, could also make GE internally more efficient. They put in new systems to, bring together data from different parts of the company, which improved communication and decision-making.
Were there any, big bumps in the road during this digital makeover?
One that comes to mind is that partnership with iVillage. It was a pretty high-profile deal aimed at creating a top online destination for women.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. It was a big deal back then.
They poured a lot of money into it, but it never really took off.
What happened?
Welch said it was because they didn't really understand the target audience and the cultures of the two companies. They just didn't mesh. It was an expensive lesson.
It shows that even someone as successful as Jack Welch, he could miss the mark sometimes.
Yeah, it reinforces how important it is to do your homework and make sure things align strategically when you're getting into new ventures. But even with that setback, Welch was still committed to e-business. He saw it as a key to growth and innovation for GE in the 21st century.
It's pretty amazing how he embraced these new technologies and adapted his leadership style to fit, this changing landscape.
And that adaptability, I think that's one of the big takeaways from our deep dive into his leadership.
It wasn't just about having a grand vision, right? It was about being willing to adjust, learn from your mistakes, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
And as we head into the final part of our deep dive, we'll see how that adaptability played out in, probably Welch's most impactful and maybe most controversial initiative, Six Sigma.
All right, so we've covered a ton of ground in our deep dives into Jack Welch, from his early days at GE to, that whole globalization push, and then, kind of late to the party, but eventually embracing the whole e-business thing.
And now we get to what a lot of people consider his biggest legacy, Six Sigma.
I got to be honest, when I first heard about Six Sigma, it sounded kind of, boring, like diving deep into statistics and process improvement and all that.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely data-driven, but it's way more than just crunching numbers. At its heart, Six Sigma is about, striving for perfection in everything you do, from making stuff to customer service, the whole 9 yards.
It's wild that something as big as Six Sigma actually started with an employee survey, right?
That's right. Welch, he was always paying attention to feedback, even when it wasn't glowing. This particular survey showed that people were worried about quality at GE. And Welch, he saw that as a serious wake-up call.
He was recovering from open heart surgery at the time, but that didn't slow him down.
Yeah, he missed his first corporate executive council meeting in 20 years because of the surgery. But he made sure his colleague, Larry Bossidy, who was already all in on Six Sigma, was there to introduce the concept to GE's leadership team.
So it's like he had this Six Sigma evangelist ready to go.
Exactly. And when Welch came back to work, he was like fired up and ready to launch Six Sigma across the whole company. It was a huge goal to achieve near perfect quality in every single part of their operations.
I mean, that sounds almost impossible.
Yeah.
Where do you even start with something that ambitious?
Well, they brought in this Six Sigma guru, Michael Harry, to train their top executives. Welch even canceled the annual golf outing at their officers' meeting so that everyone could, focus on Harry's, 4-hour presentation.
Now, that's commitment. But it wasn't just like a top-down thing, was it?
No, they put a ton of resources into training at all levels, creating this system of black belts who would lead Six Sigma projects within their own business units.
I imagine there were some bumps along the way.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Some of those early black belt candidates, they weren't exactly the best of the best. Welch tells this funny story about a Six Sigma presentation at a strategy review that was like a total disaster. The presenter, he was so unprepared that the joke became he quit before he even got to the ground floor.
Sounds like they learned a valuable lesson about picking the right people to lead these initiatives.
Yeah, as the program, matured, they got better at spotting and developing those real Six Sigma champions.
And the results speak for themselves, right? They started seeing big cost savings, productivity went up, and fewer defects, all across the board.
But it was bigger than just numbers. It was about changing the whole culture at GE, creating this mindset of always trying to improve and putting the customer first.
So it wasn't just like a factory floor thing.
Nope. They used Six Sigma everywhere, from call center response times to billing errors, even streamlining how they hired people in HR. It was a company-wide transformation.
It's similar to how Welch approached globalization in e-business. He saw those initiatives as opportunities to really change how GE did things, not just as isolated projects.
Yeah, he was always looking for ways to make GE better, faster, more efficient, and Six Sigma gave them the structure and the discipline to do that.
But was there ever a point where he felt like Six Sigma had gone too far? That it was, becoming too rigid, too much red tape?
Well, it's interesting. It was actually Welch who realized that Six Sigma needed to, evolve. He was on a trip to Spain touring a GE plastics facility, and he realized they needed to better align their internal Six Sigma metrics with what their customers actually cared about.
So it wasn't just about hitting internal targets. It was about delivering real value to the customers.
Right. And that was a big realization that led to even better relationships with customers. It turned Six Sigma from a, quality control program into a real leadership development tool.
That's a pretty cool evolution.
Yeah.
It became less about the numbers and more about creating a culture of, using data to make decisions and keeping that customer focused.
And it became the foundation for developing their high potential employees, making sure that, future leaders at GE would really understand Six Sigma.
So as we, wrap up our deep dive into Jack Welch, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from his leadership, even if we're not running a giant company?
Welch's story, it really shows the power of having a vision, having the guts to go after it, and relentlessly focusing on making it happen. He was a master strategist, but he also knew how important culture and people were.
He wasn't afraid to make big, bold moves, even if they were unpopular or risky. But he also knew when to, adjust and change direction if something wasn't working.
He believed in giving his team the power to make decisions and learn from their mistakes. But he also held them accountable for the results.
He was a charismatic leader who could inspire people, but he was also a tough boss who expected the best from everyone.
Being such a fascinating and effective leader, he challenged how things were done, pushed the limits, and turned GE into one of the most successful companies on the planet.
And even though the business world has changed a lot since he stepped down as CEO, those core leadership principles, they're still relevant today, aren't they?
Absolutely. The world's got a whole new set of challenges now. Technology changing so fast, globalization, climate change, social unrest. We need a new kind of leader to handle all of that. Leaders who are adaptable, innovative, and driven by a purpose.
Leaders who can build trust, empower their teams, and make those tough calls when things are uncertain.
Jack Welch's legacy. It gives us a guide for navigating those challenges. It reminds us that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, challenging the way things are, and never stopping learning.
So as you think about everything we've discussed in this deep dive into Jack Welch's story, ask yourself, what really stuck with you? How can you apply his insights to your own leadership journey, whether you're leading a team, a company, or just, leading your own life?
Those answers, they'll shape not only your own success, but also the impact you have on the world. And that, I think, is what truly defines a leader.